My guest this week is an author and columnist who's written for the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and is a regular contributor to Reason and my hometown newspaper, Newsday. Cathy Young, welcome to the Rubin Report.
It's great to be here.
I am very
excited.
excited.
I didn't know that was your hometown.
That is, I am a Long Islander.
Okay,
Born in Brooklyn, grew up in Long Island, lived in New York City my whole life. Now here I am in LA.
Okay.
You're a Jersey girl though, right?
I am. Well, I'm originally from Russia.
Yeah, we're going to get into that.
But I have been a Jersey girl since 1981, so it has actually been a while.
That sounds like a book right there, From Russia to Jersey.
From Russia to Jersey. Well, I did write a book called Growing Up in Moscow, which was my first book. It came out in '89 when I was fresh out of college. So.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I want to start. So,
all right.
So well done. Okay, so in my direct message, I talked a bit about Russia, and I have a sense that in the next month or so, we're going to be hearing a lot more about Russia between what's going on in Syria, people, talking about the WikiLeaks stuff, and is there somehow a connection that they want to take down Hillary? Does Trump have business ties to Russia? All of this stuff. So let's go back to your first 16 years. What was it like growing up in Russia? And if you don't want to give me your exact age, give me a rough estimate of the years.
I was born in 1963.
Okay. You never know what people.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about growing up in Russia.
So I was growing up in the Brezhnev years, and it was interesting because at the time, it really seemed like the regime that existed at the time was really forever. And it was funny because there was a book by a Russian dissident named Andrei Amalrik called Will the Soviet Union Exist Until 1984? And he picked that date because of Orwell, of course.
Right.
And it's so bizarre because at the time I heard about this book. My father was both my parents were really kind of closet dissidents, and we had banned literature in the house.
Right.
And
what was banned? What type of literature was actually banned?
Oh, anything that was critical of the Soviet system, Solzhenitsyn, of course, the works of dissidents. There were authors who were not even really formally banned, but kind of really frowned upon from the early years of the Soviet regime, like people who were executed for being sort of in opposition. Orwell, of course, was banned. I didn't actually get to read Orwell until I had left the Soviet Union.
Right.
And it's interesting because a number of people who read Orwell it was called samizdat, these typewritten, leaflets that were kind of passed around from person to person underground.
Right.
People who read Orwell or who read Orwell and sort of smuggled in foreign editions, a lot of people in the Soviet Union really were shocked to learn that Orwell had never actually been to the Soviet Union. Some of them were sure that Orwell, like George Orwell, must have been like the pen name for a Russian emigre, because who else could have understood the system so well?
Because he really understood the surveillance state.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, and the sort of the pressure to conform to the dominant ideology.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Andrei Amalrik picked that date because of the book 1984, of course. And at the time when I first heard about it, no one could really imagine that this would sort of come true, because it actually didn't exist that long past 1984. He was off by 7 years.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
No one really, when I was growing up, no one really could have imagined that. And I think that's kind of a useful thing to keep in mind when we think of today's events, in the sense that, we really have no idea whatsoever what the world is going to look like in 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
Things are really unpredictable.
They really are, and that's why I did the direct message today the way I did, because I want people to have some knowledge about some of this stuff, so that the second we start hearing about this all more, we're not all caught off guard and have no context.
But in terms of what it was like to grow up in the Soviet Union, and it's really difficult to answer in one word, because it was, in many ways, it was a complex society. It was not the same as it was in the Stalin era, where it really was kind of back then the height of totalitarianism, when very little information or content, as we would say today, was allowed to kind of seep in that was not thoroughly filtered through the official ideology. Like at the time, for instance, back in the 30s and even the 50s, Dostoevsky was banned. Maybe not officially banned, but very difficult to get, and certainly wasn't studied in schools and colleges. By the time that I was in high school in Russia, we actually had Crime and Punishment on the curriculum.
Right.
And the things that mentioned religion were kind of allowed. Again, like anything that really was not very overtly critical of the Soviet Union was okay. Like, well, Dr. Zhivago, for instance, was banned. Yeah.
Right.
But I did have the experience of growing up in a situation where, when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, when I started going to school and I started coming home and saying, oh, well, we live in the best country in the world because we have communism, that was when my parents decided that they kind of had to explain to me that, not really.
Yeah.
That is not really quite the case.
Did they hand you some of those leaflets that were going around and say,
not
read this?
Not at the age of 7, right. But they just kind of talked to me and kind of gave me a little bit of an explanation of what was what. And I remember very well my mother telling me, you cannot tell anyone at school what we talk about at home, because otherwise, we'll go to jail.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure that they would have, because again, at the time, things were a little more flexible and open than they used to be. I actually know of a situation, friends of my parents, their son started talking in kindergarten about how, his dad was saying that Lenin was really not the greatest person who ever lived.
Oh God! And what happened? What happened to this 5-year-old?
And nothing happened actually. One of the kindergarten teachers, called in his mom and said, and basically said, you know what? I don't really care what you talk about at home, but please don't do it in front of the kid because you don't know who else he's going to tell. So she was actually
so that was a pretty enlightened thing for the teacher to do.
Yeah. But so the society, there was a lot of kind of flexibility under the radar, so to speak. But officially, it was all very conformist. We had to, at school, we had to attend these mandatory meetings where everyone had to kind of repeat the slogans and, sing the praises of the Soviet Union. And this is actually one reason that a lot of the stuff that is going on today in American universities really resonates with me, because, I've been saying to my mom, my dad passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but I've been saying to my mom, this really feels like the Soviet Union, where they herd you into these, meetings where you have to sit there and say all the right things. And it's not just that you're not allowed to say, things you're not allowed to say, it's that you have to say the things you're supposed to say, which is...
well, as I'm listening to you, I absolutely see that through line. I'm not saying we're in 1972
and of course not,
Russia.
because, no one gets herded to the gulag, there isn't, because, again, when I was growing up, I did know that you could, it wasn't very likely maybe, but you could go to prison for, saying heretical things. But, we are kind of getting to the point in many areas of society where you can lose your job, for saying the wrong thing ideologically, which, in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, that actually losing your job was a much more likely outcome than going to prison, unless you were actually politically active as a dissident.
Right. It's interesting because I find that I used to give anonymous people online more crap for being anonymous. And a lot of people would respond and say, I don't want to lose my job or anything like that. Now, I don't know that there's a lot of instances of that in the United States, but it's more about that chilling effect, which is sort of what you're talking about, existed all the time. Right. So your parents never went to jail, but don't really talk about this at school or all that. Yeah. So 16 years old, you move here. Was it because you realized that there was this great opportunity for freedom?
Yeah, well,
here in
that
the
was
States?
the point when they started releasing Soviet Jews in the 70s. And my dad had actually talked for several years about leaving. My mom was a little more uncertain about it. She had a job that she really loved. She was teaching at she's a music teacher, and she actually still teaches, but wow. She was teaching at one of the top music schools in Moscow, and she had students that she was very attached to, and she just really felt, and it was funny because she felt that she would never find that kind of work in the US, and she actually ended up doing pretty well, I think. So she was a little hesitant, and it was also just sort of the general uncertainty, moving to a whole new country, learning a new language. I went to a school that specialized in English, by the way, so right. I started learning English when I was about 7. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really at the time with a view to going to America eventually. It was just because, it was a better school than most, and it was, I think because of English, there was also more exposure to, materials that you wouldn't normally see on a curriculum and right. so on. For me, it was really, at least in terms of language, it wasn't quite as intimidating. My parents really did have to kind of start all over again. Yeah. Finally, I think my parents both felt that things were getting worse toward the end of the 70s. At the time, again, no one knew what was going to happen. Yeah. A lot of people thought that there was going to be a kind of resurgence of Stalinist type, really harsh, brutal dictatorship, yeah. Where you could go to prison very easily for saying the wrong thing. Yeah. But
at that point, you were allowed to just pick up and leave? Your parents were allowed to just say, okay, we're leaving now?
Not just, no. It certainly wasn't that simple. You had to apply for permission to leave. It was not for anyone. It was basically limited to Soviet Jews, yeah. who were officially being allowed to leave for repatriation to Israel and yeah. or family reunification. And
so basically, they didn't really like the Jews, but they weren't letting the Jews leave. Is that pretty much
yeah.
fair to say?
Well, yeah. the anti-Semitism, that was another thing. The anti-Semitism was growing much more noticeable. It was getting to be very difficult for young Jewish people to get into college. My parents personally knew situations where, kids who were extremely good students were basically blackballed during the admission exams, mm-hmm. and it was this completely closed system where they didn't have to tell you where you had failed on the exams, and it was really, really easy to kind of kill you if they wanted to, yeah. especially since part of the entrance exam, by the way, was Marxism-Leninism, and they could quiz you. You had to read all these texts of, the plenary session of the Communist Party in 1956.
Right, so they were really testing
and then they could quiz you on the stuff, and it was really, again, if they wanted to fail you, it was just really easy to do that. Yeah. So, and I think that was another reason that prompted my parents to finally decide to leave. But yeah, officially, we were emigrating to reunite with my father's aunt in Israel. Yeah. And then what happened? It was the whole thing kind of existed under Jackson Vanik. It was kind of an arrangement with the United States, mm-hmm. where, Russia was where the Soviet Union at the time was getting kind of benefits and trade with the U.S. in exchange for allowing Soviet Jews to leave. Yeah. And I think there were a few other groups, like Pentecostal Christians, who were kind of a very persecuted sect, mm-hmm. Who were also part of that. But mainly it was Soviet Jews. So yeah, once you actually left the Soviet Union, then you got to Vienna as a way station, and then you got a choice of, did you want to go to Israel or did you want to go to the United States?
So you told them, or they were under the impression you were going to Israel, but then you went to the United States.
I think they kind of knew.
Or they sort of knew.
Yeah, I think they knew what was going on, because I think at the time, by the time that we were leaving, I think about 80% of the Soviet Jews who were emigrating were actually going to the United States.
So
they didn't really care.
So what was it like? You sort of had the benefit of, as you said, speaking English at an early age and going to an English school. What was it like, though, to move to Jersey, 16, and live through that?
Jersey
and now...
actually wasn't my very first
stop.
Oh,
what was the first stop?
It was Jackson Heights, Queens.
Okay, all right, close enough.
It was Jackson Heights, Queens, yeah. And this is funny. I actually worked for about 6 months before my parents eventually found work in Jersey, and that was why we ended up moving. But for a while, I was the main breadwinner because I was the person with English. And I had a job as a secretary with the Boy Scouts of America, the New York chapter.
Wow.
Yeah, because I knew how to type, and I knew how to type in Russian, but I rented a typewriter, an English keyboard typewriter, and it took me about a week to relearn how to type in English. And
what was that like? I mean, you go from Russia, now you're the breadwinner for your parents in this new country, learning a new job and all that. I mean, how did that feel?
Oh, it actually felt really exciting. That whole period of my life was actually quite exciting because, just the mere experience of going abroad, and my father actually had traveled a bit because he was a musician. He had traveled with the Moscow Symphony Orchestra. He was actually he was a sound producer for the radio, but he was also a violinist, and he did occasionally get to travel. He had some interesting experiences too. He was actually in England in 1968 when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia.
Whoa.
And he would have defected for sure if he didn't have a family back home.
Wow.
And my mom actually wasn't even sure that he was coming back because when she heard about the invasion, she was like, oh my God, he's going to defect. But no,
and he showed up at the door and everything was...
No. I think he was very, very tempted. And I don't think he was tempted to actually do it because he knew that he had a family back home.
Yeah.
But he did say, that if it wasn't for that, he probably would have made that decision because it was just, they had the experience of, being sort of booed by the audience in London. And,
sure.
It was really, really trying.
So let's flash forward.
So my dad
there's so much that we
we could go on.
There's so much we could do about just the history and being an immigrant coming here and all that.
But it was for me it was really exciting because first of all it was this whole world of information that had opened up to me, like reading Orwell
and newspapers,
and
more
reading
than one
newspapers.
Maybe,
and I remember just the experience, and I actually still remember this. I remember when we came here, I opened, I think it was the New York Post. And this was shortly before Reagan was elected. Mm-hmm. So, I open the New York Post and I see this really mean cartoon of Jimmy Carter. And I was like, this is just amazing. This is like the president. And here is this cartoon that, basically depicts him as a complete idiot.
Right. I mean, I love that. I love that because it so obviously frames so much of what you write about.
Yeah, and that was just an amazing, and that just suddenly, I still remember that because it was this moment that really crystallized, the fact of being in a free country, that you can actually do this.
Yeah.
And
all right. Well, I want to talk about some of the. I want to talk about some of the issues of being in a free country, but let's do one other thing on Russia first, because I mentioned some stuff about Russia up top. What do you make of just generally what's happening with Russia now? Just let's spend a couple minutes on, do you sense that Putin is really trying to fill this void that America seems to be leaving in the world? What is going on in Syria? Have they officially taken Ukraine? Give me we'll do 5 minutes on the state of Russia.
All right, the 5 minutes on the state of Russia. Well, I think that, Putin definitely, ever since he came to power, it's been increasingly clear that I think he wants to, rebuild Russia as a superpower. It can't really return to what the Soviet Union was, although I'm not really sure he understands that.
Yeah, I mean, that might be why he took Ukraine, right? Or at least took Crimea.
Well, he took Crimea. I mean, there is this view that Putin is sort of superhumanly clever and, he's this great strategist. I'm not really sure that's the case because, actually, arguably, he could have gotten further with Ukraine if he had just maintained tried to maintain a friendly relationship with them and, trade and so on, without actually trying to force, his person. I don't want to say his puppet because, I'm not even really sure that the president who was removed was completely a puppet of the Kremlin, but he was definitely sort of Putin's man. And I think he, in a way, kind of overplayed his hand in Ukraine. I mean, right now he's in a situation where he's much better at kind of messing things up for other countries than he is at actually doing something good for Russia.
Right.
Because right now, for instance, the situation with Ukraine is that, I mean, the new government in Ukraine is not really able to push through, the reforms that it once, partly because it's bogged down in this endless kind of undeclared war that's going on in the eastern regions. And, they've got Putin breathing down their neck, basically. But at the same time, Russia is also bogged down in this undeclared war. And it can really, a lot of this stuff can kind of come back and bite them, Russia because they're creating this kind of quasi-mercenary army of, armed people who have the experience now of fighting in this guerrilla war. And who knows what will happen when these people are told, well, we don't need you anymore because we're kind of done with this. Right. So I think this could create a lot of destabilization in Russia itself. And I could go on and on about this because he's kind of got a tiger by the tail in Chechnya because basically he made a deal with this guy, Ramzan Kadyrov, you make sure Chechnya stays a Russian province, and you make sure that Putin gets 100% of the votes in Chechnya in the elections, which I think he does, and you make sure that we get a cut of the oil profits. In exchange, you can really do anything you want. So, and this is actually kind of interesting because I know that there are people on the right in the West who see Putin as this kind of bulwark of defense against Sharia law. Under Putin's leadership, there is a part of the Russian Federation that is basically a Sharia state.
Really?
Which is Chechnya. Yeah, and not many people know about this.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, it actually is. It's, women are forced to wear veils. This is a guy who's actually spoken out in favor of polygamy, which is technically illegal under Russian law, and and there are people who've said, like, wait a minute, this guy is the president of a republic that is part of the Russian Federation. What is he doing, really advocating things that are contrary to the Russian Constitution? And of course, who really cares? Because the law currently is.
He just wants the votes to keep it part of the Federation, but then lets them. He wants the votes,
and also this guy, Kadyrov, is a very, very strong Putin supporter. Like he, if necessary, he will bring out his troops that are loyal to him, to fight. It's pretty well known that he's sent people to eastern Ukraine to fight in the guerrilla war there. So but at the same time, it is kind of a tiger by the tail situation because if suddenly it becomes advantageous for Kadyrov to turn on Putin, who knows what's going to happen? And he's a pretty dangerous guy. He's kind of the classic warlord who's got his people who are extremely loyal to him. Yeah. And so it's I don't think Putin is quite as smart as he's often given credit for. I think a lot of the time when he's succeeded, it's mainly because of the failures of the West, because he, as you said, he's he's good at stepping into the vacuum that arises when, for instance, American leadership kind of pulls back.
Yeah, so that's the perfect segue, of course, to everything that's going on in Syria. What is he trying to accomplish in Syria? Is he really trying to keep Assad in power?
Yeah.
Period.
And I think part of that is really just to signal that, he stands behind his allies. And yeah, he's ostensibly making noises about, creating the preconditions for, Assad to talk to the opposition. But, given the way that Putin treats the opposition in Russia,
right?
I mean, okay, he doesn't carpet bomb them, you know, but that's really, other than that,
right? He's doing the rest of it.
He's really not a talking to the opposition guy.
Right.
He's more of a, kill the opposition quietly, or put them in jail, or basically leave them with no institutional support whatsoever guy. And I think it's really fairly clear that the murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was at one point a really popular governor, who later became part of the opposition, and who had the charisma really to appeal to people. I don't know that he actually was directly a threat to Putin, but even so, it's fairly clear that there was some kind of official hand in his murder.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that kind of tells you a lot about how Putin feels about dealing with the opposition.
Right. So basically, the idea is for him, it's
here
like
I think
I'm backing,
he wants to keep Assad in power.
I'm backing my guy. It's probably good for the economy at some level, right? Keeping the war going.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's good for kind of maintaining his strongman image, both inside and outside Russia. Putin very clearly kind of has an affinity with dictators. He gets pretty upset at regime change anywhere. He was I've heard stories, and again, these are sort of rumors from people who have been on the inside. But I've heard that he was extremely upset by what happened to Gaddafi, and that he really took that personally.
Right.
Like, he took it personally in
that could
be me someday way. And I think part of his issues with the United States, and I think it goes back to Iraq and a few other things, but he really does see the United States as, promoting regime change around the world. And I think that's part of his beef with the U.S.
Yeah, so is that the irony of where we're at the moment, that it seems to me that the Democrats and Hillary are more anti-Russia than the Republicans at the moment. Now, maybe Trump has business ties there. It's very unclear. But Hillary was for going in and toppling Gaddafi, and apparently now it came out that a lot of the leaders of the army were saying don't do it. So there is some legitimacy to Putin's fears, I suppose. If you were Putin, you can understand the fears.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that when we look at, and I don't really want to get into the whole Middle East situation.
Yeah. We're going to move to America.
Because otherwise we're going to spend the next half hour talking about the Middle East.
Yeah.
But, I think that, I understand the kind of anti-interventionist argument. I think we've definitely overextended ourselves and, doing things around the world that get us into really messy situations. At the same time, I'm a little skeptical of this whole kind of line of argument that, we've made such a mess. And there is this assumption that if only it weren't for our intervention, like everything would be, peaceful and quiet.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And I think that in a way, it's funny because it kind of parallels a lot of the left-wing arguments about foreign policy. Like, the other day I saw somebody on Twitter, and I'm not even sure why this came up, but for some reason they were talking about how, it was really Nixon who was responsible for the genocide in Cambodia. I'm like, what? I mean, I'm sorry, but, Pol Pot was actually responsible for that.
The guy who did it, actually,
So it's this mindset that somehow the West is behind everything bad that happens in non-Western countries. And I think it's, again, kind of ironic that we're seeing the same kind of mindset on the anti-interventionist right today. And again, this is not to say that, mistakes haven't been made, so to speak.
Right.
But it really doesn't mean that, if we hadn't blundered in Libya and in Iraq and so on, that region today would be just, a model of peace and quiet.
Right.
I don't think that's
and
the
as
case.
I've mentioned,
We have no idea, by the way, what would have happened.
We don't, but we do know that actually Iraq was better and they were having basically free elections. And then we left.
Right,
George W.
right.
Bush had signed the thing to leave, but Obama is the
right,
one who
right.
decided
Yeah, and I think
for us to leave,
think there's collective responsibility for this. I think leaving aside the merits of the invasion itself, I think it's pretty clear that the administration in Iraq post-invasion was very badly mismanaged, and I think that was part of why I think they weren't able to get a deal that would have allowed us to keep some troops there. But again, we don't want to get into all
but
of
I
that.
think what you're saying is that not everything all the time is always America's fault.
No, it's not. And it's really whether you're blaming George W. Bush or whether you're blaming Hillary and Obama, it's really much, much more complicated than that. There are forces, and it's kind of ironic because in a way, it's demeaning, really, to the people in those countries to say that, oh, well, everything they do is really only because of instigation and so forth.
Right, that they only react.
They have their own extremely complicated history. And they do things for their own reasons. I mean, obviously we contribute for better or for worse, but it's really an oversimplification to say that, oh, well, and a lot of conservatives are saying that now, oh, well, Hillary started this mess in the Middle East. Really?
You guys...
you really want to say, you really want to go there?